Silence suffocated courtroom 302 of the Cook County Courthouse. Richard Sterling adjusted the knot of his bespoke Tom Ford tie, a barely perceptible, triumphant smirk dancing on his lips. Beside him, his high-priced attorney casually shuffled papers, already mentally cashing his exorbitant retainer. Across the dividing aisle, Sarah sat perfectly still, her knuckles white as she gripped a scuffed leather notebook. Everyone in the packed gallery, the whispering reporters, Richard's sycophantic colleagues, even her own exhausted attorney, believed the battle was definitively over. She was about to be stripped of her life's work, her home, and her children. But as the gavel hovered, ready to finalize her ruin, nobody realized the quiet woman at the plaintiff's table had spent 3 years setting an invisible trap, and the jaws were finally about to snap shut. Rain lashed against the tall, reinforced windows of the courthouse, casting jagged, weeping shadows across the polished mahogany floor. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, nervous sweat, and the electric tension that only comes from witnessing a public execution. Today, the execution was financial and reputational, and the victim was Sarah Sterling. Richard Sterling sat back in his chair, exuding the effortless confidence of a man who owned the building, the city, and everyone in it. He was a prominent real estate developer, a man whose face graced the covers of business magazines, lauded for his philanthropic galas and his razor-sharp business acumen. He looked the part of the aggrieved, patient husband. His silver-streaked hair was impeccably styled, and his posture communicated a weary sadness. A masterful performance curated for the benefit of Honorable Judge Patricia Carmichael, a veteran of family law who peered down at the courtroom over her half-moon reading glasses. Next to Richard sat Arthur Pendleton, a man whose reputation in the legal world was akin to a great white shark in a swimming pool. Pendleton did not lose. He orchestrated annihilations, and for the past 3 days he had systematically dismantled Sarah's life, piece by bloody piece. Sarah sat at the opposing table, a stark contrast to her husband's polished gleam. She wore a simple navy blazer and slacks, her dark hair pulled back into a severe knot. She looked tired. The dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights, of tears wept in the privacy of her small, rented apartment, of the crushing weight of fighting a billionaire with seemingly endless resources. Her lawyer, David Rossi, rubbed his temples. Rossi was a good man, a scrappy underdog who usually handled modest settlements, but he was entirely out of his depth against Pendleton's corporate juggernaut. The core of the dispute was the Sterling empire. Sarah had not just been a dutiful wife, she had been the silent architect of Richard's initial success. 15 years ago, it was her inheritance that provided the seed money for his first major acquisition. It was her late-night number-crunching and brilliant logistical mind that saved his second development from bankruptcy. Yet legally, her name was on almost nothing. Richard had structured a labyrinth of shell companies, offshore trusts, and holding corporations that effectively legally erased her contributions. Worse, Pendleton had spent the entire week painting a horrifying, fabricated picture of Sarah. He introduced doctored financial records, heavily manipulated emails, and testimonies from heavily compensated friends that painted Sarah as emotionally unstable, fiscally irresponsible, and secretly struggling with a severe gambling addiction that had allegedly siphoned millions from Richard's hard-earned accounts. "Your Honor," Pendleton's voice boomed, rich and theatrical, breaking the silence of the room. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Over the past 72 hours, we have demonstrated, with incontrovertible documentary evidence, that Mrs. Sterling has engaged in a systematic pattern of marital waste, deceit, and psychological instability. My client, Mr. Sterling, has done nothing but try to protect his family, his children, and his employees from the erratic, destructive path his wife has chosen." Rossi shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He leaned over to Sarah, whispering under his breath, "Sarah, he's killing us. The judge is buying this narrative. The offshore accounts in your maiden name, We still haven't found a way to prove Richard set them up. If we don't present something concrete, she's going to grant him full custody, and you'll walk away with a fraction of the alimony, let alone your equity share." Sarah did not turn her head. She did not blink. She merely stared at Richard. Richard caught her eye and offered a small, sympathetic tilt of his head, a gesture so condescending, so laden with private mockery, that it would have made anyone else scream in frustration. "I know, David," Sarah whispered back, her voice remarkably steady, devoid of the panic her lawyer was currently drowning in. "Let Arthur finish painting his masterpiece. You can't trap a predator until he is absolutely certain he has caught his prey." Judge Carmichael tapped her pen against a stack of exhibits. "Mr. Pendleton, you have submitted Exhibit 42C, which outlines a series of wire transfers to a bank in the Cayman Islands. You assert these were authorized solely by Mrs. Sterling." "Indeed, Your Honor," Pendleton nodded gravely, approaching the bench to hand over a heavily highlighted ledger. "Authorized by her, using private credentials, transferring funds from a joint operational account into a private trust, to which my client had absolutely no access. Mr. Sterling only discovered this massive hemorrhage of capital 3 months before filing for divorce. It broke his heart." Richard looked down at his hands, feigning sorrow. In reality, he was hiding a grin. He had spent 2 years setting up those accounts, using Sarah's old passwords, rotating the IP addresses to make it look like they originated from her personal laptop. It was a flawless frame job. Sarah watched the judge flip through the pages. She knew exactly what was in that ledger. She knew the exact dates, the exact amounts, and the exact lies typed in black ink. Everyone in the room believed she was ruined. They believed she was a gold digger caught stealing from her benefactor. They believed she had lost. But under the table, inside her scuffed leather notebook, lay a single, unassuming piece of paper. A piece of paper that Richard, in all his arrogant brilliance, had entirely forgotten about. The trial resumed after a brief morning recess. The air in the courtroom felt heavier, the humidity of the rainstorm outside seeping through the old stone walls. David Rossi stood up to begin his redirect, but before he could even utter a word, Arthur Pendleton was back on his feet. "Your Honor, the defense calls Sarah Sterling to the stand," Pendleton announced. A collective murmur rippled through the gallery. Calling the opposing party to the stand during this phase was an aggressive tactic. It was designed to break the witness publicly, to force a meltdown that would cement the narrative of instability. Rossi grabbed Sarah's arm. "You don't have to do this. We can object. He's going to try to rattle you." "Let him," Sarah said, calmly untangling her arm from Rossi's grip. She stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her blazer, and walked towards the witness box. Her footsteps echoed against the hardwood floor, slow and deliberate. She raised her right hand, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. Pendleton approached the podium like a predator circling a wounded animal. He didn't carry notes. He didn't need them. "Mrs. Sterling," Pendleton began, his tone deceptively soft, "would you describe your marriage to Richard as an equitable partnership?" "I would describe it as a partnership built on my initial capital and his public face, yes," Sarah replied, her voice clear and carrying perfectly across the silent room. Pendleton chuckled, a sound meant to belittle. "Your initial capital. You refer to the $300,000 you inherited from your grandfather 15 years ago, a sum that my client, through his sheer brilliance, turned into a real estate empire worth over $800 million. Is that correct?" "He did not do it alone," Sarah stated flatly. "No, of course not." Pendleton paced laterally across the floor. He had a team of hundreds of executives, architects, and financial advisors. "Tell me, Mrs. Sterling, what was your official title at Sterling Holdings?" "I didn't have an official title. Richard preferred to keep my involvement unofficial to protect our assets from early liabilities." "Unofficial," Pendleton repeated, tasting the word like sour milk. "So no title, no salary on the books, No signatures on the primary corporate charters, just unofficial help, like picking out the drapes for the office lobby. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is badgering the witness, Rossi barked, leaping to his feet. Sustained. Mr. Pendleton, watch your tone, Judge Carmichael warned, though her eyes remained fixed on Sarah, analyzing her demeanor. Apologies, Your Honor, Pendleton said smoothly. Let us move to something official. Let us discuss the Cayman accounts. He walked to his table and retrieved a thick folder, dropping it onto the wooden rail of the witness box with a loud thud. Mrs. Sterling, I have here records of 37 individual wire transfers, ranging from $50,000 to over $200,000, routed from Sterling Holdings' secondary operating account into a trust named the Serenity Fund in Grand Cayman. Do you recognize this trust? I recognize the name, Sarah said, her gaze steady. Oh, you recognize the name. How convenient, Pendleton sneered. And do you also recognize the digital signature authorizing these transfers? The IP logs tracing back to the laptop kept exclusively in your private study. I recognize that they appear to point to me, Sarah answered carefully. Richard, sitting at the defense table, leaned back. He was thoroughly enjoying the show. He watched Sarah, waiting for the tears, waiting for the stammering, the desperate pleas of innocence that he knew no one would believe. He had paid top dollar to the best cybersecurity fixers in the underworld to ensure those IP logs were airtight. Appear to point to you, Pendleton raised his voice, stepping closer to the box. Mrs. Sterling, these documents don't just point to you. They scream your name. Over $4 million vanished from your husband's business, a business you claim to have unofficially built, right around the same time you were taking frequent spa trips to Las Vegas and Monaco. Spa trips that our private investigators revealed were actually extended stays at high-stakes baccarat tables. Those trips were arranged by Richard, Sarah said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, hinting at the buried steel beneath her calm exterior. He insisted I needed rest. He insisted you needed rest. So you went and gambled away his fortune? Is that your testimony? I did not gamble. I have never played baccarat in my life. Pendleton scoffed, turning toward the gallery to ensure the press caught his expression of utter disbelief. Denial is a common symptom of addiction, Mrs. Sterling. Just like the erratic behavior reported by your household staff, the late-night screaming fits, the vanishing for days at a time, the absolute neglect of your two beautiful children, Michael and Emily, who were left in the care of nannies, while you allegedly managed unofficial business. That hit a nerve. A brief, sharp flash of genuine anger crossed Sarah's eyes. Pendleton saw it and smiled internally. He had found the crack. My children are my life, Sarah said, her voice trembling for the very first time. Richard manipulated the staff. He threatened their jobs if they didn't sign those affidavits. More conspiracy theories. Pendleton sighed, looking up at the judge. Your Honor, we have presented the financial records, the IP logs, the sworn affidavits of 5 different household employees, and the testimony of Mr. Sterling himself. Mrs. Sterling offers us nothing but paranoia and denial. He turned back to Sarah, his eyes cold. You didn't just lose your husband's money, Sarah. You lost your mind. And now you're going to lose your children. The courtroom was dead silent. The brutality of the statement hung in the air. Rossi was out of his chair, yelling another objection, but the damage was done. The narrative was cemented. Sarah looked small in the witness box, a woman entirely crushed by the sheer weight of a billionaire's fabricated reality. No further questions for this witness, Your Honor, Pendleton concluded, walking back to his seat with the swagger of a conquering general. Judge Carmichael looked at Sarah with a mixture of pity and stern judicial finality. Mr. Rossi, do you have any redirect? David Rossi looked at Sarah, who was slowly stepping down from the box. He looked at his legal pad, entirely empty of counter-arguments. No, Your Honor. The plaintiff reserves the right to present closing arguments. Very well. It is 12:30. We will take a 1-hour recess for lunch. When we return, I expect closing statements, after which I will retire to make my ruling on the division of assets and primary custody." Judge Carmichael banged her gavel. "Court is in recess." As the gallery erupted into furious whispers, Richard walked past Sarah. He leaned in, ensuring only she could hear him over the noise. "You should have just taken the settlement I offered a year ago, Sarah," Richard whispered, his breath smelling of peppermint and expensive coffee. "Now you leave with nothing. The kids will call Jessica Mom by Christmas." Jessica Bingham, the 26-year-old executive consultant Richard had been seeing for the last 3 years, the woman he was secretly moving into Sarah's home. Sarah stopped. She turned her head slowly, looking Richard directly in the eyes. The vulnerability she had shown in the witness box evaporated instantly, replaced by something cold, sharp, and terrifyingly calm. "Enjoy your lunch, Richard," she said softly. "Make sure you eat something heavy." The courthouse cafeteria was a depressing, fluorescent-lit basement, filled with the smell of stale coffee and damp wool. Sarah and David Rossi sat in a secluded corner booth. Rossi was aggressively massaging his temples, a half-eaten turkey sandwich sitting ignored on a paper plate before him. "I don't know what to do, Sarah," Rossi admitted, his voice ragged. He was an honest lawyer, which made him a terrible liar, and right now he couldn't lie to his client. "Pendleton slaughtered us up there. The judge has made up her mind. I can see it in her posture. The financial fraud angle, the gambling. It's a perfect frame. We have circumstantial denials against a mountain of forged, but legally admissible, paper." Sarah took a slow sip of her black coffee. She didn't look like a woman who had just had her character publicly executed. She looked like a chess player staring at a board where her opponent had just aggressively overextended their queen. "David," Sarah said, setting the paper cup down, "do you remember when I hired you?" 2 years ago, Rossi said. "You walked into my office in the strip mall, handed me a retainer in cash, and told me you needed a lawyer who wasn't golf buddies with Arthur Pendleton. I also told you that Richard was a meticulous man," Sarah continued, her eyes locked on his. "Richard doesn't just cheat. He builds entire architectures of deceit. He isolates his targets. He controls the flow of information. He buys the people around you so you feel entirely alone." "He did a great job," Rossi muttered bitterly. "Even the nanny, Maria. I thought she loved your kids." "Maria's mother needed a liver transplant," Sarah said softly. "Richard paid for it, under the table. Of course she signed the affidavit. I don't blame her." Rossi stared at her, stunned. "You knew that. Why didn't we bring that up?" "Because proving a billionaire paid for a dying woman's surgery makes him look like a saint, David. It doesn't prove coercion. It proves philanthropy. I told you, Richard is meticulous." Sarah reached down and pulled her scuffed leather notebook from her tote bag. She placed it on the laminate table. "But meticulous men have a fatal flaw. They believe they are the smartest person in the room. They become so obsessed with the grand illusion that they forget to cover their tracks in the shadows." Rossi frowned, leaning forward. "Sarah, what are you talking about? We go back in there in 30 minutes for closings. If you have some sort of miracle in that notebook, now is the time to share it." Sarah opened the notebook. Inside were hundreds of pages of handwritten notes, dates, times, and strings of seemingly random alphanumeric codes. "For the last 3 years, Richard thought I was depressed," Sarah began, tracing her finger over a page filled with tiny, precise handwriting. "He thought the isolation he subjected me to was breaking my mind. When he started working late with Jessica Bingham, I didn't confront him. When he started locking me out of the corporate accounts, I didn't throw a fit. I let him think I was docile. I let him think I was stupid." She flipped a page. "But I built the foundation of Sterling Holdings, David. I know the internal server architecture better than the IT department, because I wrote the original administrative protocols 15 years ago." Rossi's eyes widened. "You had a back door?" "Richard changed all the passwords. He upgraded the firewalls, Sarah nodded, but he forgot about a legacy server we used in the very first year, a dusty old tower sitting in the basement of the corporate office that controls the HVAC systems. I never told him I linked the HVAC server to the primary email archiving system to prevent overheating failures in the old server room. Rossi stopped breathing. Are you telling me? I couldn't access his current files, but I could access the automated backups of every single keystroke, every deleted email, every hidden ledger, routing straight through the thermostat network, Sarah said, a chillingly calm smile finally breaking across her face. For 3 years, I have watched him build this frame job. I watched him pay the hackers. I watched him draft the scripts for the affidavits. I watched him transfer the real money to Jessica Bingham's brother in Zurich while setting up the Serenity Fund to make me look like a thief. Jesus Christ, Sarah, Rossi hissed, looking around the cafeteria to ensure no one was listening. Why didn't you give me this during discovery? We could have destroyed him months ago. If I submitted digital evidence during discovery, Pendleton would have had months to fabricate a defense, Sarah explained, her voice dropping to a whisper. He would have claimed I hacked the servers. He would have claimed I planted those emails. He would have dragged this out for another 5 years in appellate courts, bleeding me dry until I had nothing left to fight with. No. Pendleton and Richard had to commit. They had to put their lies on the official court record, under oath, in front of a judge. She reached into the back pocket of the notebook and pulled out a small, encrypted USB drive, placing it gently on the table next to Rossi's untouched sandwich. They just spent 3 days committing perjury, David. They just entered fraudulent documents into federal court. They locked themselves in the burning house. Sarah tapped the USB drive. Now we hand the judge the match. Rossi stared at the little metal stick as if it were a live grenade. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He looked at Sarah, truly seeing her for the first time. She wasn't a victim. She was an apex predator who had disguised herself as prey, waiting patiently in the tall grass while the lions celebrated their kill. "What's on this drive?" Rossi asked, his voice shaking with a mix of awe and adrenaline. "Audio," Sarah said. "Audio of what?" "A phone call Richard made to Arthur Pendleton 2 weeks ago. I bugged Richard's private study. Technically illegal, yes, but admissible under the crime-fraud exception if it proves an attorney and client are actively conspiring to commit perjury and submit forged evidence to a court." Rossi swallowed hard. The crime-fraud exception. It was the nuclear option in legal proceedings. If proven, it stripped away attorney-client privilege entirely. Pendleton wouldn't just lose the case. He could be disbarred. Richard wouldn't just lose the divorce. He could face federal prison for perjury and fraud. "They're going to object," Rossi said, wiping a sudden sheen of sweat from his forehead. "Pendleton will scream that it's inadmissible, that it's a violation of privacy, wiretapping laws." "Let him scream," Sarah said, gathering her notebook and standing up. The cafeteria lights caught the hard, uncompromising glint in her eyes. Judge Carmichael hates being made a fool of more than she hates procedural irregularities. Once she hears the first 10 seconds of that recording, she won't care how we got it. She'll want blood. Rossi grabbed the USB drive, his hand trembling slightly as he dropped it into his briefcase. He looked at his watch. 1:25 p.m. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked, her voice completely devoid of the exhaustion she'd worn all week. "I've never been more ready for anything in my entire life," Rossi replied, grabbing his briefcase. They walked out of the cafeteria and towards the elevators, side by side. The storm outside seemed to be breaking, pale sunlight trying to pierce through the heavy Chicago clouds. As they rode the elevator up to the 3rd floor, neither of them spoke. The time for words was over. When they pushed open the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 302, the atmosphere was entirely different. Richard was laughing softly with Pendleton, leaning back in his chair, completely relaxed. The reporters in the gallery were checking their phones, already drafting their headlines about the downfall of the Sterling wife. Judge Carmichael emerged from her chambers, her robes rustling in the quiet room. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and picked up her gavel. "We are back on the record in the matter of Sterling versus Sterling," Judge Carmichael announced, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "We are at the phase of closing arguments. The defense has rested its case. Plaintiff, you may proceed." David Rossi stood up. He didn't look nervous anymore. He walked slowly to the center of the floor, carrying nothing but his laptop and a small projector cord. He didn't look at the judge immediately. Instead, he turned and looked directly at Arthur Pendleton. "Your Honor," Rossi said, his voice ringing with a newfound, dangerous authority, "the plaintiff waives the right to a traditional closing statement." A ripple of confusion went through the gallery. Pendleton's brow furrowed, a sudden, unfamiliar prickle of unease crawling up his spine. Richard stopped smiling. "Waives?" Judge Carmichael asked, surprised. "Mr. Rossi, this is your final opportunity to summarize your client's position before I make a ruling that will deeply affect her life. Are you certain?" "I am certain, Your Honor," Rossi said, plugging the projector cord into his laptop. "We waive a traditional closing statement because, during the recess, new evidence was brought to my attention. Evidence that drastically alters the foundational reality of this entire trial." "Objection!" Pendleton roared, slamming his hands on the table and shooting to his feet. "Your Honor, the discovery phase ended months ago. The plaintiff has rested. This is an outrageous procedural violation, a desperate 11th-hour stunt by a desperate legal team." "It is not a stunt, Your Honor," Rossi spoke over Pendleton, his voice calm and steady. "It is an invocation of the crime-fraud exception regarding attorney-client privilege. I hold in my possession evidence that the defense counsel, Mr. Pendleton, and his client, Mr. Sterling, have knowingly, willfully, and maliciously conspired to submit forged financial documents to this court to commit fraud." The courtroom exploded. Reporters gasped, dropping their pens. Richard's face drained of all color, turning a sickly ashen gray. Pendleton's mouth opened, but for the first time in his illustrious career, no sound came out. Judge Carmichael slammed her gavel down, once, twice, 3 times, the sound cracking like a rifle shot. "Order! Order in this court!" she bellowed, her eyes blazing as she leaned over the bench, glaring down at Rossi. "Mr. Rossi, that is the most severe accusation an attorney can make in my courtroom. If you do not have absolute, incontrovertible proof to back up what you just said, I will hold you in contempt and have you disbarred by Friday." Rossi met the judge's furious gaze without flinching. He pressed a button on his laptop. "Your Honor," Rossi said quietly into the sudden, terrifying silence of the room, "I'd like to play an audio file. And then, I'd like to ask Mr. Sterling one final question." Judge Patricia Carmichael did not suffer fools, and she absolutely abhorred being manipulated. Her courtroom was her kingdom, and Arthur Pendleton had just been accused of tracking mud, specifically felony-level fraud, all over her pristine floors. "Your Honor, I demand this charade be stopped immediately," Pendleton shouted, his usually resonant voice cracking into a shrill, desperate register. He pointed a trembling finger at David Rossi. "This is an illegal wiretap. It is the fruit of the poisonous tree, inadmissible in any court of law." "Sit down, Mr. Pendleton," Judge Carmichael commanded, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "If Mr. Rossi is playing a parlor trick, he will leave this courthouse in handcuffs. But if you are interrupting me to suppress evidence of your own criminal conduct, you will be joining him. Are we clear?" Pendleton opened his mouth, but the sheer, unadulterated fury radiating from the bench forced him to snap his jaw shut. He sank slowly into his chair, his impeccable posture collapsing. Beside him, Richard Sterling was rigid, staring at the small black speaker Rossi had placed on the plaintiff's table as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. "Play it, Mr. Rossi," the judge ordered. Rossi pressed the spacebar on his laptop. For 3 agonizing seconds, there was only the soft, rhythmic hiss of static, Then, the unmistakable sound of ice clinking against heavy crystal echoed through courtroom 302, followed by a voice that made every reporter in the gallery simultaneously gasp. "Relax, Arthur. Have a scotch. The woman is entirely broken. She barely even looks at the bank statements anymore." It was Richard. His tone was casual, dripping with the arrogant, patrician drawl he usually reserved for private country club lounges in Aspen. A second voice, strained and cautious, responded. It belonged to Arthur Pendleton. "I don't like it, Richard. Forging the IP logs is one thing, but creating a phantom trust in the Caymans? If forensic accounting actually digs into the Serenity Fund, they'll see the seed money came from your private shell company in Delaware, not her personal accounts." "They won't dig," Richard's recorded voice laughed, a cold, metallic sound. "Rossi is a strip mall ambulance chaser. He doesn't have the resources to subpoena Delaware LLCs, let alone pierce the Cayman veil. Besides, the IP logs are flawless. We paid those Romanian contractors $250,000 to make it look like Sarah authorized every single transfer from her private study. As far as the court will see, she's a degenerate gambler hiding money." In the courtroom, Richard's face had gone from ashen grey to a sickening, mottled purple. He looked violently ill. The recording continued. Pendleton's voice sighed heavily. "And the household staff? What if the nanny cracks?" Maria looked terrified during the deposition prep. "Maria's mother is breathing through a machine at Northwestern Memorial," Richard sneered on the tape. "I paid off the hospital administration to bump her up the transplant list, and I'm covering the $500,000 medical bill out of pocket. Maria will read the script we gave her. She'll testify that Sarah was screaming at the kids and wandering around in a manic state. She'll say exactly what she needs to say to keep her mother alive. It's handled, Arthur. By Friday, I'll have full custody. The business will be entirely isolated from the marital estate, and Jessica can finally move her things into the master bedroom." Rossi hit the spacebar again. The audio cut out, leaving a suffocating, absolute silence in its wake. The rain outside seemed to have completely stopped, as if even the weather was holding its breath. Sarah remained perfectly still at the plaintiff's table. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't smirk. She simply watched her husband with the cold, detached interest of a scientist observing a microscopic parasite struggling under a slide. Judge Carmichael slowly removed her half-moon reading glasses. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from an incandescent, righteous rage. She had been on the bench for 22 years. She had seen ugly divorces, bitter custody battles, and corporate greed. But the sheer, sociopathic calculation of what she had just heard, the weaponization of a dying woman's medical care to steal a mother's children, was abhorrent on a level that defied legal precedent. She turned her gaze slowly towards the defense table. Pendleton was staring at the mahogany grain of his desk, his face buried in his hands. Richard was hyperventilating, his Tom Ford tie suddenly looking very much like a noose. "Mr. Pendleton," Judge Carmichael whispered, the sound carrying across the dead quiet room, "do you have anything to say before I call the Federal Bureau of Investigation and have this courtroom sealed?" Arthur Pendleton, the shark of Cook County, the man who had never lost a high-stakes divorce, stood up on trembling legs. The instinct for self-preservation, honed over decades of cutthroat litigation, overrode any remaining loyalty he had to his billionaire client. "Your Honor," Pendleton stammered, his voice raw, "I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Furthermore, I formally request to withdraw as counsel for Mr. Sterling, effective immediately." "You are not going anywhere, Mr. Pendleton," Judge Carmichael snapped, her gavel pointing at him like a loaded weapon. "You are to remain in that chair. You are not to speak to your client. You are not to touch your phone." She turned her blistering gaze to Richard. "Mr. Sterling, you are going to retake the witness stand, right now, and you are going to answer every question put to you, under penalty of immediate incarceration, for contempt of court and aggravated perjury. Bailiff, if Mr. Sterling attempts to leave this room, tackle him." The armed bailiff standing by the heavy wooden doors rested his hand firmly on his holster. "Yes, Your Honor." Richard stood up, his legs moving mechanically. The illusion of the untouchable tycoon had completely shattered. He stumbled toward the witness box, looking wildly at the gallery, where reporters were frantically typing on their phones, undoubtedly sending breaking news alerts that would tank Sterling Holdings' stock price before the closing bell. He sat down heavily in the wooden chair, looking like a man who had just stepped onto a trap door with the rope already tight around his neck. David Rossi approached the podium. He didn't need notes anymore. He felt a surge of adrenaline, fueled by the quiet confidence of the woman sitting behind him. "Mr. Sterling," Rossi began, his tone lacking any of the deference he had shown earlier in the week. "You just heard the audio. You admitted to fabricating the IP logs. You admitted to creating the Serenity Fund in the Caymans to frame your wife for marital waste. Is it not true that the $4 million you lost was actually routed back to a Swiss bank account controlled by Thomas Bingham, the brother of your mistress, Jessica Bingham?" Richard swallowed hard. His eyes darted to the judge, then to Rossi. "I refuse to answer on the grounds that it may incriminate me." "You already incriminated yourself on the tape, Richard," Rossi stated flatly. "But let's move past the money you stole from your own family. Let's talk about the business you claim to have built entirely on your own." Rossi walked back to his table and retrieved Sarah's scuffed leather notebook. He opened it to a heavily tabbed section and pulled out a stack of printed, highly technical schematics. He approached the bench and handed a copy to the judge, then placed another copy on the rail of the witness box. "Mr. Sterling, you testified under oath this morning that your wife had no official role in Sterling Holdings, that she merely helped in an unofficial capacity, perhaps picking out drapes. Do you recognize the documents I just handed you?" Richard stared at the papers. They were lines of complex administrative code, server architectures, and root directories. To him, they looked like an alien language. No, these are just computer files. They are the foundational administrative protocols for the entire digital infrastructure of Sterling Holdings, Rossi corrected him. They control the payroll, the internal communications, the proprietary valuation algorithms, and the secure client databases. Tell me, Mr. Sterling, who holds the primary administrative access keys to this architecture? "The IT director," Richard mumbled, sweating profusely. "Bradley Jenkins. We pay him handsomely." Rossi smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile. "That's interesting, because according to these digital timestamps, verified by an independent cybersecurity audit that Mrs. Sterling commissioned last month, Bradley Jenkins only holds secondary access. The primary God mode access, the root directory that cannot be overwritten, deleted, or locked out, was established 15 years ago. It has never been transferred." Rossi leaned in close to Richard. "Who established that root access, Richard?" Richard looked at Sarah. For the first time in 3 years, he truly looked at the woman he had married. He saw the brilliant, analytical mind that he had utilized to build his fortune and then foolishly tried to discard like a broken toy. He realized, with a wave of absolute nausea, that he hadn't just been outplayed. He had been outclassed from the very beginning. "Sarah did," Richard whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the courtroom's air conditioning. "I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you," Rossi said loudly. "Sarah built the network," Richard snapped, his composure finally breaking. "She built the algorithms. She managed the early acquisitions because I didn't know how to code the risk assessment models. Are you happy?" The courtroom erupted into whispers again. The entire foundation of Richard's defense, that Sarah was a useless, unstable dependent, was collapsing in real time. "So," Rossi summarized, pacing in front of the jury box, "Mrs. Sterling provided the initial seed money. Mrs. Sterling built the foundational architecture of the company, And when you decided you wanted to replace her with a younger woman, you used the wealth she helped generate to orchestrate a massive criminal conspiracy to ruin her reputation, steal her children, and leave her destitute. Objection, Pendleton croaked weakly from the defense table, more out of muscle memory than actual legal strategy. Counsel is testifying. Overruled, Judge Carmichael snapped without looking away from Richard. Mr. Rossi, do you have further questions for this witness? Rossi looked at Sarah. She gave him a microscopic nod. Just one more area of inquiry, Your Honor, Rossi said. He turned back to Richard. Mr. Sterling, you've been very busy over the last 3 months moving capital around to hide it from this divorce proceeding. Specifically, moving liquid assets into holding companies in Zurich. How much liquid cash did you transfer out of Sterling Holdings' domestic accounts? Roughly $32 million, Richard admitted, his eyes locked on the floor. He was a beaten man. 32 million, Rossi repeated, and you used the company's primary internal routing system to authorize those transfers, correct? Yes. Rossi closed the leather notebook with a sharp snap. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Carmichael leaned back in her heavy leather chair. The magnitude of the deception was staggering. She looked at Richard Sterling, a man who had walked into a courtroom that morning, radiating the arrogant invincibility of wealth, now reduced to a trembling, sweaty mess in the witness box. Mr. Sterling, Judge Carmichael said, her voice dropping into a deadly conversational tone, I have sat on this bench for over 2 decades. I have seen spouses lie about assets. I have seen them hide money in mattresses, in offshore accounts, and in relatives' names. But I have never, in my entire career, witnessed a conspiracy so deeply malicious, so utterly devoid of human decency, as the one you have orchestrated against the mother of your children. Richard flinched as if he had been struck. Your Honor, You will speak when spoken to, Judge Carmichael roared, the sudden volume making the armed bailiff jump. You attempted to use my courtroom as a weapon to destroy an innocent woman. You coerced medical patients. You forged federal banking documents. You committed perjury multiple times, on the record. She picked up the stack of server schematics Rossi had handed her and adjusted her reading glasses. She studied the documents for a long moment, the silence in the room stretching until it felt like a physical weight. Then she looked over the rim of her glasses directly at Sarah, and finally back to Richard. There is one detail that bothers me, Mr. Sterling, the judge said slowly, tapping her pen against the wood. A detail that makes me question not just your morality, but your basic intelligence. Richard looked up, confusion briefly piercing through his panic. You testified that you used your company's primary internal routing system to secretly transfer $32 million to Zurich, Judge Carmichael said. But you also just admitted, under oath, that your wife, Sarah Sterling, retains the primary God mode administrative access to that exact routing system. Access that supersedes yours. The blood drained from Richard's face completely. He turned slowly, his neck cracking in the quiet room, to look at his wife. Sarah was sitting perfectly upright, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes held the terrifying, absolute calm of a storm that had just leveled a city. Judge Carmichael leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Mr. Sterling, considering Mrs. Sterling had completely undetected root access to every digital keystroke you made, did it never occur to you to check if the money you thought you were hiding actually arrived in Zurich? Richard's mouth opened, but he couldn't breathe. His hands began to shake violently. What do you mean? Rossi stepped forward, pulling a final, single sheet of paper from his briefcase. Your Honor, if I may submit one final piece of documentation into evidence. Exhibit F. The bailiff took the paper from Rossi and handed it to the judge. She read it, her eyebrows shooting up toward her hairline. A slow, deeply satisfied smirk spread across Judge Carmichael's face. It was the look of a referee watching a bully get knocked out in the first round. Let the record reflect, Judge Carmichael read aloud, her voice ringing clear and triumphant, "that Exhibit F is a verified wire transfer confirmation from the United States Department of the Treasury. It appears, Mr. Sterling, that 3 months ago, the moment you initiated the transfer of $32 million to the Swiss account of Thomas Bingham, an automated protocol within your server, a protocol secretly coded by the primary administrator, intercepted the transaction." "Intercepted?" Richard gasped, gripping the wooden rail of the witness box to keep from collapsing. "Where did it go?" "It didn't go to Zurich, Mr. Sterling," Judge Carmichael said, dropping the paper onto her desk. "According to this document, Mrs. Sterling utilized her foundational administrative privileges to reroute the entirety of the $32 million directly into a secure, heavily monitored escrow account held by the Internal Revenue Service. She then simultaneously filed a comprehensive whistleblower report with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, detailing your entire history of corporate embezzlement, tax evasion, and wire fraud." The courtroom erupted into absolute chaos. The reporters in the gallery were standing up, shouting questions. Even Rossi looked mildly shocked. Sarah hadn't told him about the IRS escrow account. She had kept her ultimate kill shot entirely to herself, ensuring it couldn't be leaked or stopped. Richard let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. He wasn't just broke. He hadn't just lost the divorce. By legally transferring stolen corporate funds directly to the IRS alongside a whistleblower complaint, Sarah had mathematically guaranteed that Richard would face federal tax evasion charges. He was going to federal prison, and because Sarah was the registered whistleblower who provided the documentation of his tax fraud, she was legally entitled to up to 30% of the recovered funds as a federal reward. She hadn't just protected her assets, she had legally weaponized the federal government to liquidate him. "Order!" Judge Carmichael banged her gavel repeatedly, struggling to hide her own grim satisfaction. "Order in my court!" When the room finally quieted down, the only sound was Richard Sterling weeping openly in the witness box, his face buried in his expensive, tailored sleeves. Judge Carmichael looked down at him with zero sympathy. "Mr. Sterling, you are hereby remanded into the custody of the court, pending immediate federal investigation for perjury, conspiracy to commit fraud, and wire fraud. Bailiff, place him in handcuffs." The heavy clink of steel cuffs snapping around Richard's wrists echoed like a final, definitive period at the end of a long, ugly sentence. As the bailiff pulled a sobbing, ruined Richard to his feet, Judge Carmichael turned her attention to Sarah. The judge's expression softened, a profound respect visible in her sharp eyes. "Mrs. Sterling," Judge Carmichael said gently, "in the matter of custody, I am immediately granting you sole physical and legal custody of your children, Michael and Emily. Mr. Sterling will be permitted 0 contact, pending psychological evaluation and his upcoming criminal trials." Sarah closed her eyes, letting out a long, shuddering breath. For the first time in 3 years, the steel mask cracked, and a single tear of profound relief rolled down her cheek. "Furthermore," the judge continued, her voice ringing out for the official record, "I find that Mr. Sterling has committed egregious marital fraud. Consequently, I am piercing the corporate veil of Sterling Holdings. I award you, Mrs. Sterling, 100% of the marital estate, including sole ownership of the primary residence, all liquid domestic assets, and immediate executive control of Sterling Holdings." Judge Carmichael picked up her gavel one last time. She looked at Pendleton, who was still frozen in his chair, contemplating his imminent disbarment, and then at Richard, who was being led towards the holding cells. "Everyone in this room believed you had lost, Mrs. Sterling," Judge Carmichael concluded, a faint smile on her lips. "It turns out, you were the only one playing the game. This court is adjourned." The gavel fell with a thunderous crack. Handcuffs are incredibly heavy. That was the first coherent thought that penetrated the thick fog of panic engulfing Richard Sterling's mind. The cold, unyielding steel bit into his wrists as the Cook County bailiff shoved him, none too gently, down the fluorescent-lit concrete hallway toward the courthouse's temporary holding cells. Behind him, the muffled roar of the courtroom gallery still echoed through the heavy oak doors, a sound that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. Back in courtroom 302, Arthur Pendleton did not wait to offer his former client any parting words of comfort. The moment Judge Carmichael banged her gavel, Pendleton practically sprinted from the room, dialing the managing partners at his prestigious law firm. He was already drafting his resignation in his head, desperately hoping to secure an early retirement package before the Illinois Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission suspended his license. It was a vain hope. Within 24 hours, his name would be synonymous with legal malpractice across the entire state. Down in the holding cell, a grim, windowless room smelling of bleach and stale sweat, Richard was granted his one statutory phone call before his transfer to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in downtown Chicago. His hands shook so violently he could barely dial the numbers on the stainless steel wall phone. He bypassed his corporate fixers and dialed the one person he believed was still entirely his, Jessica Bingham. The line rang twice before she picked up. "Jessica," Richard gasped, leaning his forehead against the cinder-block wall, tears of pure terror streaming down his face. "Jessica, you have to listen to me. It's a disaster." "Sarah, she knew everything. The IRS has the money. They arrested me. You need to call your brother Thomas in Zurich and—" "Thomas doesn't have the money, Richard," Jessica's voice interrupted him. It wasn't the sweet, adoring tone she had used for the past 3 years. It was flat, businesslike, and painfully distant. "And he's not taking your calls. Neither am I, after this." Richard froze. The air in the tiny cell seemed to evaporate. "What are you talking about, Jessica? I love you. We were supposed to move in together this weekend." A heavy sigh crackled through the receiver. "Richard, did you honestly think I didn't notice when your wife's private investigators started following me 6 months ago? Or when the IRS Criminal Investigation Division sent an agent to my apartment last Tuesday?" "The IRS," Richard whispered, his stomach dropping into an endless abyss. "Sarah came to see me, Richard," Jessica stated coldly. "She brought documentation. She showed me exactly how you were using my brother's accounts to launder embezzled corporate funds. She told me that if I didn't cooperate, I would be indicted as a co-conspirator in federal court for wire fraud and tax evasion." "You—" Richard choked on his own breath, the final horrific piece of the puzzle sliding into place. The audio recording, the bug in my private study. "I didn't plant a bug, Richard," Jessica said, her tone dripping with pity. "I just left my phone on record when I was sitting on the leather sofa, drinking my tea, while you paced around bragging to Arthur Pendleton. I gave the audio file to Sarah in exchange for full legal immunity from the Treasury Department. She even gave me a generous severance package from her own private accounts so I could relocate to Seattle." "You sold me out," Richard sobbed, sliding down the rough wall until he was sitting on the cold concrete floor. "No, Richard," Jessica corrected him. "I just looked at the math. You built a house of cards on top of a woman who was infinitely smarter than you. I just chose the winning side before the building collapsed. Goodbye, Richard. Don't call this number again." The line went dead, leaving Richard alone with the dial tone and the crushing weight of his absolute ruin. Meanwhile, 3 floors above, Sarah Sterling emerged from courtroom 302. The storm clouds that had battered Chicago all morning had finally broken, and brilliant shafts of afternoon sunlight poured through the tall windows of the courthouse corridor. David Rossi walked beside her, carrying his battered briefcase like a shield. He looked at Sarah with a mixture of profound awe and slight intimidation. "I have to admit, Sarah," Rossi chuckled nervously, shaking his head. "When you hired me, I thought I was taking on a standard, albeit difficult, high-net-worth divorce. I didn't realize I was acting as the front man for a masterclass in corporate espionage and federal whistleblowing." Sarah stopped and turned to him. The severe, exhausted lines that had etched her face for months seemed to have vanished. She looked younger, lighter, and completely at peace. "You did perfectly, David. You were exactly what I needed. Honest, loyal, and brave enough to stand up to Pendleton when it counted. I will be retaining your firm as the primary outside counsel for Sterling Holdings moving forward. We have a lot of restructuring to do." Ross's jaw practically hit the floor. The retainer for a corporate entity of that size would secure his firm's future for the next decade. "I don't know what to say. Thank you, Sarah. You earned it," she said with a warm, genuine smile. As they reached the heavy brass doors leading out to the courthouse steps, a sea of reporters and flashing cameras awaited them. The news of a billionaire being arrested mid-divorce trial had leaked instantly, sending the press into a frenzy. Microphones were thrust into Sarah's face the moment she stepped into the Chicago air. "Mrs. Sterling, is it true your husband embezzled millions? Sarah, are you taking over Sterling Holdings? What do you have to say to the people who believed your husband's allegations?" Sarah paused on the top step. She didn't shy away from the cameras. She looked out over the crowd, her posture impeccable, the undeniable new head of an empire. "For years," Sarah spoke, her voice clear and carrying effortlessly over the clamor, "my husband operated under the assumption that a quiet partner is a weak partner. He mistook my patience for ignorance, and my dedication to my family as a vulnerability to be exploited. Today, the justice system proved that the truth, no matter how deeply buried under lies and expensive lawyers, will always find the light. I am going home to my children, and tomorrow I am going to work." She didn't take any further questions. Escorted by court security, she descended the steps and climbed into the back of a waiting black town car. As the car pulled away from the curb, navigating through the bustling downtown traffic, Sarah leaned her head back against the soft leather seat. She pulled her phone from her purse and opened a photo of her 2 children, Michael and Emily, smiling brightly at a park. The battle was over. The predator was locked in a cage of his own making, and the empire she had secretly built was finally hers to rule in the light. She locked her phone, closed her eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, Sarah Sterling simply rested. Greed often blinds people to the very foundation holding them up, and Richard Sterling learned the hard way that you should never underestimate the quiet architect of your success. Sarah's story is a brilliant reminder that patience, meticulous planning, and an unbreakable devotion to the truth will always outmaneuver arrogance and deceit. She didn't just survive the storm her husband created. She became the lightning that burned his corrupted empire to the ground. If you were captivated by Sarah's incredible real-life chess match and her triumphant fight for her children and her dignity, please smash that like button and share this video with anyone who loves a brilliant underdog story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another deep dive into the most jaw-dropping, true-life dramas of justice being served. See you in the next one.